Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Cahill, and I'm pleased to be the host of the Liblit Memorial Scholarship Committee's 2021 Larry Swanson Waste on Wednesdays seminar series in conjunction with Stony Brook University School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. Uh, Before we get started, I'd like to take a minute to remind everyone about the Liblit Scholarship and what we do. Evan Liblit was a highly respected recycling and waste professional who passed away at age 47 in 1995. He worked for the EPA, the DEC, the town of Babylon in the private sector, and was also a teacher. He was highly respected and loved by those who knew him. After his passing, a number of his colleagues created a Liblit Scholarship Fund at Stony Brook University to continue his legacy. Over the last 24 years, the scholarship fund has provided scholarships to 22 plus graduate students and more than 19 undergraduate scholars. Many of the scholarship recipients have gone on to become leaders in their fields. Our scholarship funds are raised traditionally at an annual breakfast that is held around America Recycles Day. And we're happy to say that this year we'll be returning to a breakfast in person at the Irish Coffee Pub on November 17th. We would urge anybody who is interested to or available to attend the breakfast and support the scholarship fund. Prior to COVID, the scholarship committee began a series of symposia that we held originally in person at Stony Brook University to a capacity crowd, and that was held to discuss the recycling crisis and other important waste issues. And in 2020, we adapted to the symposium to a Zoom format because we couldn't appear together due to COVID. And for 2021, we're continuing these webinars through the October-November period in celebration of America Recycles Day, and to address pressing regional solid waste issues. The Liblit Scholarship Committee has renamed the Waste on Wednesdays webinars after Dr. Larry Swanson of Stony Brook University. As many of you know, Larry passed away late last year. His passing left a tremendous void not only for his family, but also his Stony Brook colleagues, the countless students whom he mentored, the professional affiliations and groups across Long Island. To many of us, he was a great man who inspired others and brought the right attention to matters affecting our local government, our local environment, and our local government. As a founding member and advocate of the Scholarship Fund, it was only appropriate to rename these webinars after him. In a sense, Larry is still here teaching us what we need to know. For today's webinar, in terms of logistics, just please be aware that everybody will be muted except for the speakers. If you have questions for our speaker today, please enter them into the chat box on your screen, and we'll try to group them together and answer them at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar is entitled Environmental Justice in New York State. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Alana Kedel-Tucky. Alana is the acting director of the DEC's Office of Environmental Justice. In her position, she focuses on crafting materials and messaging to improve communications between the EJ, environmental justice communities, and the agency, as well as analyzing policies related to climate justice, adaptation, and social resiliency. In addition to her work for the Office of Environmental Justice, Alana has served as Deputy Director of Legislative Affairs and worked on diversity, inclusion, education, and public outreach with the Office of Communication Services. Alana came to state service after several years working as a government relations associate with the Adirondack Council, a not-for-profit organization dedicated to the preservation of the Adirondack Park. Prior to this, she served as the government affairs coordinator for the Empire State Pride Agenda. Alana holds a Juris Doctorate from the Albany Law School, which means she's a lawyer like me. So let's give her a little extra sympathy. She has a bachelor's degree in political science from SUNY Binghamton with a minor in sociology. And it's my pleasure right now to introduce Alana Kedel-Tucky, Director of the Office of Environmental Justice, to tell us about that organization and also to talk a little bit about the status of the Climate Justice Working Group created by the Environmental Conservation Law Amendment that went into effect earlier this year. Alana?
Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss the Office of Environmental Justice and the work we do at DEC, as well as the work we're doing regarding the Climate Justice Working Group and this Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
I've got it.
All right, fantastic. So the Office of Environmental Justice, this is a new little cute graphic that we have. We just kind of commissioned it. So you're kind of not really seeing it in its full glory. It's usually much, much bigger, but we definitely wanted to make sure that we're including a large part of the folks that we reach out to and communicate with on a regular basis. Let's see, there we go. So the Office of Environmental Justice was established in 1999. So by standards of DEC, it's younger than a lot of the other programs at the agency. And we're a smaller office, but we have a unique position in that we touch and communicate with all aspects of DEC, and that we sort of act as a liaison. So in addition to our work with the agency and educating the agency, we're also advocates for environmental justice communities and the environmental justice programs. So our efforts are to prioritize low-income communities and communities of color that face disproportionate environmental impacts. This is done through internal and external education and training. We work with programs to promote environmental justice and engage our Indian nations here in New York State. And we provide funding to funding opportunities for impacted communities. So kind of like to summarize it, our goal and our programs, we work with our 9 DEC regions and to make sure that everyone at all aspects of the environmental process are considering environmental justice and environmental justice principles. The goal is to elevate the concerns and the issues that environmental justice communities are dealing with, and to ensure that communities are getting a meaningful opportunity to engage in the decision-making. For many, many years, environmental justice communities have not been at the table and have been sort of dealing with environmental impacts sort of as they come. And the goal of this is to allow for folks to have a seat at the table and to determine what happens in their own communities. The roots of environmental justice are found in social justice movements like the civil rights movement. So our office follows the EJ principles of participation, self-determination, and fair treatment, respect, and justice. The goal is to make sure that access to decision-making and self-determination, both on an economic and political political terms for low-income communities and communities of color, so they can address sort of the systematic failures that have created environmental justice communities. So that includes the disproportionate siting of undesirable land uses in low-income and communities of color, and the inequitable enforcement of laws in these communities. So some of what governs and guides what we do are commissioners' policies. Commissioners' policies, for those who are not familiar with them, are similar to executive orders from the governor, in that they have the effect of law, but really only in DEC. So these policies don't extend outside of the agency. They affect only DEC's programs and policies. We do have other agencies that have, and other municipalities that have sort of taken on aspects of our commissioners' policies for their purposes, but they really only affect DEC. So the general policy that deals with environmental justice is Commissioners Policy 29. So it is our general overall policy that provides guidance to incorporating environmental justice concerns into the DEC's environmental permit process, which is a large part of how that's been viewed. And that was how that was written in 2003. So anyone, and basically it's a DEC application of the State Environmental Quality Review Act, which will talk about briefly later on. Another policy that affects the Office of Environmental Justice and environmental justice areas is Commissioner's Policy 37. This is deals with environmental benefits projects. So it provides that any sort of administrative respondent, which is typically someone from the regulated community, they can take on an environmental benefits project in lieu of a settlement in an enforcement matter, in lieu of an obligation to pay a penalty. So priority for these, and this happens just in general. So priority is given to these environmental benefits projects that take place in our potential environmental justice communities. All of these projects have to improve, restore, protect, and reduce the public risk to health or environment that was achieved by the respondents' full compliance with the laws and regulations. So basically, they have to leave it in a better condition than when they found it. And they need to, basically consider what would have happened had they been doing what they were supposed to do in the first place. And the last commissioner's policy that sort of directly or indirectly relates to the Office of Environmental Justice is Commissioner's Policy 42. And that provides guidance to DEC staff on concerning the cooperation and consultation with our 9 recognized Indian nations within the boundaries of New York State. We communicate within, regarding issues related to protection and environmental and cultural resources throughout the state. So now we are just going to quickly go over what I call the fun part of all aspects, which are all the rules and regulations. And as a lawyer, that is kind of a lot of what I like. And I know everybody else is really excited to talk about those as well. So one of the regulations that helps govern environmental justice is Part 487, which establishes the framework for how we deal with environmental justice issues with regards to the siting of electric generating facilities. So the regulation kind of has 2 goals. It enhances the public participation process and the review of environmental impacts for these proposed facilities in environmental justice communities. And the goal is to reduce the disproportionate impacts in these overburdened communities. As I stated before, these communities typically are overburdened with facilities in their communities. So the goal is to make sure that even though we all deal and we all benefit from having electricity and access to these items, there are folks who bear a disproportionate burden for these comforts that we all enjoy. So the goal of this is to try to minimize or mitigate that burden to the extent possible. So the next piece of regulation or act is the Uniform Procedures Act. And this isn't simply just under for DEC, this is a state act. So it establishes our procedures for how we administer our regulatory permits. And it basically provides consistency because it provides a framework and procedures for how we do all of this. So it's intended to ensure that there's fair and timely, thorough reviews. It eliminates any inconsistent procedures, and it shows us how we're to engage in public through public notification, through hearings, and letting folks know when we've reached a final decision. So next, we have the State Environmental Quality Review Act. Again, this is across all state and local agencies have to complete and review the things pursuant to seeker. So this really, you have to classify actions, whether they're like type 1 or type 2. You have to determine impacts. And this is where I think a lot of folks are probably familiar with our permitting process when we are determining, positive declarations, or we call them POSDECs, which is where we've determined that something has a, significant impact on the environment, or negative declarations or NEGDECs, where we've determined that there won't be a significant environmental impact. So seeker itself is a self-enforcing act, meaning that each agency is responsible for meeting the compliance obligations. There's no sort of, overarching authority that is watching us to make sure that things are going correctly. And we don't have the authority to sort of enforce or review the seeker implementation for another agency, and they don't have that authority to, do that for us. But failure to properly implement seeker will result in legal action and has resulted in legal action in the past. And it can result in the rescission of project approval. So it does behoove DEC and state agencies to follow the seeker guidelines, or we, end up looking bad when we have to rescind negative declarations. And next, we have the State Administrative Procedures Act, or SAPA. And again, this goes across state government rulemaking, and it helps us with regards to, it guides our rulemaking and the promulgation of regulations. The act intends to create, again, consistency throughout the administrative rulemaking and adjudicatory licensing process across the state agencies and all government bodies. And it guarantees that actions conform with the state constitution and with statutory law and case law. And it really, the goal is to reduce any sort of misunderstanding or confusion so that across state agencies, that these are the rules, these are how things are supposed to be handled. It, kind of clarifies and, fine tunes our statutory authority. So now that we're done with all that fun, regulatory and, rules, we'll get into the more boring aspects like our, grants and all the other interesting things. I'm kidding. The thing that we're probably most known for in the Office of Environmental Justice is our grant program. We've had this grant program since about 2006. It started off with our community impact grants, and it has since expanded to include several other grants that we offer to community-based organizations. So we offer a variety of these grants. The goal is to empower communities to develop and implement solutions to environmental issues and harms and health hazards. And it also can build community capacity and help set priorities. And, a lot of it is used for community education and outreach. You'll probably notice if you've looked at our website, you'll get to see some of our more recent grant awardees. And it's also available in open data if anybody's interested in checking out some of the grants that we've awarded. We've given a lot of community gardens, which are especially critical in times when we're dealing with food scarcity, food deserts, and making sure that folks have access to healthy produce. So our main goal for the main program, like I said, is a community impact grant. So that grant provides organizations with funding, that doesn't have to be matched funding. It's just funding for projects that directly address environmental harms and disproportionate impacts to these communities. In order for a community to be eligible for our grant, it needs to be a community-based organization or non-government organization. So we're talking about areas or community organizations that serve an area that's no bigger than a borough. So we're not talking about statewide organizations or even county to county organizations or countywide. We're talking about very small community-based organizations that usually don't have the kind of funding that it takes to employ a full-time grants writer, and sometimes would not be able to avail themselves to funding streams from like the federal government. We're making sure that, a lot of these community organizations that, kind of get lost in the shuffle when it comes to seeking, grant funding can at least get something for the work that they're trying to do. And so all the projects that we fund have to address the community's exposure to the multiple environmental harms. And we've given out, since about 2006, we've given out over $10 million in community impact grants. We have additional grants. One is the Green Jobs for Youth grant that focuses on educating and preparing youth between the ages of 16 to 24 for the green economy through partnerships with educational, organizations and educating universities, colleges, and people who are out there who are actually doing green technology and green work. A lot of the grants that we funded help students and youth get certified so that they can find jobs in the future, or so that they can move on to colleges and universities and have this under their belt. Another grant that we've offered and will be offering again is the Urban Environmental Education Center, the goal of which is to build and to enhance environmental education centers in our urban centers, specifically in environmental justice communities, so that people have a place to come to learn about the ecology of the community and to learn about issues and harms and how to mitigate these issues and harms in their communities. And the more recent one that we've given out is the administration of capacity building grants. We've done that once, but we do hopefully intend to do that one again. And that was a grant that allowed for community-based organization to actually distribute micro grants to even smaller organizations, just to help them, complete some of their projects. All of our projects have a scientific and research element. So all of our grantees at the end of their projects do submit the final report that shows the effects of what they've done and, the outreach and the scientific background that they used and how they kind of developed the program. Our grants are typically 2 to 3 years, and the funding for our grants comes from the Environmental Protection Fund. Everybody knows what the Environmental Protection Fund is, correct? Should I? Okay. I don't know if I needed to describe what the Environmental Protection Fund is, but for those who don't know, the Environmental Protection Fund is a guaranteed source of funding, ideally a guaranteed source of funding that was developed specifically so that regardless of the economic situation of New York State, this funding would be there to fund environmental projects and as an environmental resource, and ideally never, ever, ever touched to fill budget gaps. I said ideally. That hasn't always happened, but that is the goal in the end. So another program that we have under our belt, it's mostly in Region 2. The goal is to kind of expand this throughout the state, but it's Operation EcoQuality. This is an initiative that we take on in partnership with our program, with a lot of our enforcement programs, which are our environmental conservation officers, and with our agency staff to focus on these mid-sized, not these large facilities, but these kind of small and mid-sized regulated facilities that are in environmental justice areas. So it's a three-pronged approach. We reach out, we consult, and we try to bring them into compliance. So it's to improve the community's quality of life and reduce the public health risks but communicating directly with these facilities rather than just kind of coming in and throwing out violations. The goal is to educate them on the best management practices and pollution prevention, and do it in a way that sponsors and fosters a relationship with the community. So our campaigns are a partnership between our agency and the community, and it always begins with our ECOs and our regional staff kind of conducting outreach with community leaders and residents to get a better understanding of the issues in the neighborhood, and then the program staff conducting environmental assessments in the communities with those 3 phases. So there's a pre-assessment that is just about collecting information. We're not, nobody's going kicking down doors. It's about collecting information. There are site visits where where our ECOs and staff are going into the site to identify potential violations. And we sort of give them a list to say, these are things that you need to do to bring yourself to compliance, and offer support on how to assure that they can come into compliance. And then there's a post-site visit, which includes, a regulatory review and a confirmation that they've come into, made the changes to come into compliance. I couldn't tell you overall what the percentage is, but I will say that it's a very high percentage of the facilities that we work with through this process do come into compliance. Well, obviously we have facilities that don't and need a little bit of extra help, and some that, will eventually need to pay a fine. But as part of it, it really does help to bring folks in compliance, have a more positive view of DEC, and also see how they can be stewards and good neighbors to folks in the community. Another part of Operation EcoQuality, which is actually in the photo that you're looking at, are our ECOs that patrol areas that have heavy diesel truck traffic, and we go to ensure proper emission standards. So our officers will usually go through areas, environmental justice areas, and they'll issue tickets for violations for truck idling, smoke opacity, and anything that exceeds the standards. So, and we also try to make sure that folks have up-to-date emissions inspections and things of that nature. So unfortunately, our Indian Nations consultation coordinator, David Witt, couldn't be here. So I will do my best to discuss Indian Nation affairs and consultations. So our office engages, and DEC engages with Indian nations on issues that relate to natural resources and cultural resources. We work for programs on consultation, and we develop a relationship and coordinate our efforts. Our nations, as you'll see here, this is a map of our nations updated in September. With regards to the Oneida, there actually have been purchasing land that's being held in trust. So even though this doesn't get directly into it, this area is a little bit bigger now, so that's good. But we work with our Indian nations on a government to government basis. So we don't address them or discuss with them or work with them in a way that we do with interest groups. We work with them as government, as sovereign government nations, to work on issues that we have in interest, and we try to collaborate on issues related to climate change, related to land resources, the gathering of herbs, hunting, fishing. The goal is to make sure that we have a relationship with them very similar to how we relate to government, and that we respect them as sovereign individuals sovereign nations and governments who just happen to be within the boundaries of New York State. And again, this is the CP42 that we talked about before. It just sort of dictates, if anybody wants to look again, that's available on our website. It also dictates training to our staff on how to communicate with our nations, if specifically our ECOs, if they ever encounter them, in a situation. So, and the sort of last slide is what we'll get into. This is what kind of we've been doing with the Climate Justice Working Group and with the Environmental Justice Act of 2019. So I'm going to start with the Environmental Justice Act. We call it that. It didn't really have a name. It's actually Article 48 of the Environmental Conservation Law. It establishes an overarching statewide environmental justice policy, and it mandates that no subsection of the population should be disproportionately exposed to environmental harms or have to bear a disproportionate burden from environmental harms. It also establishes that there should be overarching policy of equitable division of environmental assistance and resources, and opportunities for citizens to meaningfully participate in the environmental process, and that should be reflective of diverse interests and perspectives within these affected communities. A part of that is the creation of a permanent environmental justice advisory group and an environmental justice coordinating council, interagency environmental justice coordinating council. So the Environmental Justice Working Group, which is not currently working, but we hope to have them in place very, very soon, will be working on developing this model statewide policy. Once that policy has been established, state agencies will have the option of either developing their own policy based on that policy or just adopting that policy in general. The bill also, and the statute also directs that agencies that have engaged in any sort of action or operations that have any sort of significant effect on the environment need to appoint an environmental justice coordinator that provides information to the public on the agency's operations and policies. It also requires agencies to develop training and workshops and materials to better engage the public and to better work on environmental justice issues. The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act is something that we've been working on as well. It sets the goal of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to 85%, beyond the 85%, and net zero emissions across all sectors of our state economy. The part that DEC is part of an Office of Environmental Justice largely deals with is the creation of the Climate Action Council, which will be drafting a scoping plan, and is, if anybody's been watching those actions, outlining the recommendations for achieving these goals, and Climate Justice Working Group, which will be establishing criteria for defining identifying disadvantaged communities, which are named in the legislation, and how communities should consider the disproportionate impacts from, on those communities. So what they've been doing is examining different types of criteria and indicators, and those criteria and indicators will be used to create a sort of a categorization of disadvantaged communities across the state of New York. And once those communities are identified, a minimum of 35% of all benefits for renewables, et cetera, will be sort of targeted towards those communities. Like I said, it's a minimum. The goal will be to have at least 40% to the extent that's practicable for any state agency. But the goal is to target these very heavily overburdened communities to help them sort of mitigate any issues that they've had over the past, and to restore them to where other more heavily invested communities are. So just sort of a quick look at some of the tools that we use and the tools that can be used for environmental justice. What we have here are our environmental justice maps. We have this on our DEC info locator. If anybody wants to visit our general DEC website, what it does is we have an environmental justice layer that goes over it. And you can actually take a look at the website and see where communities are and where our regulated facilities are in connection. And if you are so bold, you can also add an additional layer that shows where recreational layers are. So you can get a good idea of how far recreational opportunities actually are to a lot of environmental justice communities versus how many regulated facilities such as electric generating facilities, coke burning facilities, and incinerators are to these communities. So that's the DEC info locator. We've recently updated our environmental justice maps for a very long time. We had some very kind of stationary maps that were based on the 2000 census. We were able to update those maps to a GIS layer for using ArcGIS that uses American survey data that is based on the 2014 to 2018 census. We should be updating that very soon to reflect, I believe it's going to be in December, it'll be the 2016 to 2020 census data will be reflected. And of course, we also utilize EPA's EJ screen. It kind of gives, it's a great tool that gives a snapshot of different areas. And so you can actually take a look at, different square footage or different areas and look at the different indicators, different environmental justice and different demographic indicators. And so lastly, if you're looking to contact the Office of Environmental Justice, feel free to reach out to us. We love answering questions. That's my desk number. I don't know if I should have put that on there, but I did. So it is what it is. If you're looking for specific information on certain issues, I will say that for Indian Nation affairs and consultation, Dr. David Witt is absolutely the person that you'll definitely want to speak to. He's our Indian Nation affairs coordinator. Rodney Rivera in our Region 2 New York City office is absolutely the expert when it comes to Operation EcoQuality. And Dana McClure is our grants administrator. So if you have any grants questions, she's definitely the person that you should speak to. She is a whiz when it comes to this. She used to actually work for an organization that applied for a lot of grants. So she is a master when it comes to the grants gateway. But that is my presentation.
Well, thank you, Alana. I think we've got some questions to ask, and I'm going to
Sure.
start with one that I kind of made a note for early on in the presentation. This uh, would apply to Part 487 of
Mhm.
the regulations. As you know, I think that Long Island is there are a lot of projects being proposed to bring on new wind power
Mhm.
in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Long Island, and these projects will need to have some uh, point at which they land on Long Island, and then transmission lines constructed to distribute that power. How will Part 487 affect, the decisions for local government to accept, negotiate about, or object to the ultimate plans that come along that says we're going to put a transmission line that's going to land here and move north or west to some other point? How much
Well,
will
yeah.
487 be applicable to that?
Well, 487 is most likely not going to be applicable to that. 487 deals with more traditional electric generating facility sightings. It will be handled with the Office of, is it renewable siting, renewable energy siting, which is ORES. So the regulations through Office of Renewable Energy Siting are where those will live. And so actually, we've recently received several permit applications that have come from the Office of Renewable Energy Siting. So it'll be very similar to how we deal with our permit applications now. Any permit application that is located, that's coming from an area that is either in or near an environmental justice community will get enhanced scrutiny. So it will have to go through the enhanced public participation plan. So there'll need to be sufficient amount of notice. An actual public participation plan will have to be created. And communities will need to be notified and have an opportunity to communicate directly with any applicant and answer questions or have their questions answered.
And can local government officials get in touch with your office if they have questions about that process?
Absolutely.
Okay. Um, I'd like to move a little bit along to the a couple of questions came in, one from me and one from Adrian Esposito about the EcoQuality uh, uh, initiative. Um, I think you said earlier that your staff is not a large one.
No, 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 we're not.
When you work with EcoQuality, or do you have statewide, do you employ the regions? Do you have a liaison at the region that helps to implement, the EJ policies, or is that something that you will devote personnel to on a case by case kind of basis?
So right now, we've really only been able to do Operation EcoQuality in our Region 2 office, and that encompasses the New York City area. Right, and like I said, Rodney Rivera has largely spearheaded that campaign. It's sort of taken a bit of a hit due to COVID, but our goal is to try to get back out there as soon as possible. I know that we were in the middle of a few inspections before COVID hit. So the goal is to try to get back out there and kind of restart that. There is an opportunity and a desire to sort of take this a little bit more statewide to replicate it. Obviously, we can't just have Rodney go area to area to do that. So we would be working with our regional staff to implement EcoQuality across the state.
And that Adrian Esposito had a question as to whether that under that program you do or could do air testing of various communities to see, the effect of whatever local impacts are there. Is that something that is regularly done or can be done?
If it's not, I believe that we do have our air engineers are a part of the staff group that does go out to make sure that different smaller facilities are in compliance. But a large part of the groups and that we're dealing with are usually, like I said, they're usually smaller community facilities. But for example, when you're dealing with a dry cleaner, you need somebody from like, the Office of Air Resources, and you also need somebody from remediation and from spills and hazardous waste, because, you're dealing, with dry cleaning chemicals. But like I said, it's usually smaller facilities, but we try to get as many folks from our different programs as possible to go out and examine to see where the violations are. Does that answer the
Okay,
question?
this one from Kendall Christensen. I think you touched on this, but the question is, do EJ considerations factor into facility permitting activities, both
Yes.
existing facilities for renewals apparently, or proposed facilities?
They do if they're in or near an environmental justice community. We have occasionally made exceptions for facilities that aren't necessarily in EJ communities, but they do have several factors that are concerning. For example, large amounts of wastewater discharge, high levels of lead contamination, a large population of folks who are either linguistically isolated, or if that, even though the minority population may not be in the majority, they are extremely close. We have asked facilities and applicants to undergo the public participation process.
Okay. I guess I'd like to move into the area of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act and the statute that was passed.
Mhm.
I guess ECL 75 dash what was it? Okay. 75-0111 creates the Climate Justice Working Group.
Mhm.
And its charge is to identify the disadvantaged communities that would benefit from the investment
Yes.
subsection of Article 75. And that seems to me a pretty broad description of available funding. All state
It is.
agencies and public authorities and entities that have available and relevant funding must devote a minimum of 35% and a maximum or a goal of 40% of all of those funds into the designated communities that are identified by the working group.
Yes.
Can you describe, or has it been formulated, just what funds would be the kind of funds that are available and relevant? Would that include, I mean, is there our funding available now, or is it future legislative appropriations, or how would federal grants to the state for clean energy or housing improvements or that sort of thing come into play? Does the state, do you guys know, just how much money we're talking about there?
We really don't. And we're actually working on that right now. There are a lot of moving parts with that. Each state agency and authority, corporation, we all distribute funds differently, and we have different rules attached to how we do things. For example, a state authority has a lot more freedom with regards to how they distribute funds and how they can invest their money than DEC, for example, that's sort of, in a position of having to use the competitive grants process. So we are currently in talks with other agencies that are going to be charged with coming up with this 35 to 40% for benefits and investments to determine exactly how that's going to look. So people know exactly what funding is available, what investments will be made, and how that looks for each individual agency, authority, corporation.
Well,
So we don't have that
be,
just yet.
Yeah.
We are looking to make sure that we have something like that, and there should be some guidance that will be put out to assess people so there's no confusion.
Well, I guess I'm thinking in terms of an organization like the Public Service Commission, or the revenue that would be generated if, for example, a carbon tax was adopted in New York. Would that, and if the PSC made application for and received federal monies to expand the transmission grid or construct additional power generating facilities around Long Island or upstate or anyplace else. Would that funding be directed more initially to disadvantaged communities, or would there be a first come first served sort of situation, or do we know how we're going to redirect or direct that revenue to actual projects that get built on the ground in New York?
Unfortunately, I honestly couldn't say. We don't have those mechanisms in place right now because we don't even have a list, a quote unquote list of disadvantaged communities. We are working through the process right now with the Climate Justice Working Group to try to determine how that's going to look for the community. So whether or not we're going to try to cover, if anybody's been paying attention, especially to the meeting that we just had yesterday, dealing with the issue of whether to try to cover every single disadvantaged community or look to try to work with the most disadvantaged communities and put them sort of on the list first, and keeping in mind that there will be communities that are left out. But as for how those investments will be made and how that funding will be distributed, that I honestly cannot tell you that right now. We like I said, we're working in a group to try to figure out exactly how that's going to look. And like I said, it's going to be different based on each agency, corporation, but hopefully we will have something for you soon.
Okay, let me see. At this point, I think, I guess I should point out that, as you said, all of the proceedings of the Climate Justice Working Group, the regular meetings are all recorded. They're all on the state's website, as are the meetings that have been held by the Climate Action Council beginning over a year ago. And, if you haven't, looked at those, it's a real education. An awful lot of work has been done. And I think the deadlines now are to have, for the Climate Action Council, a scoping plan to implement, to lay out what the means are going to be and what's the pathway to get to the goals in 2030 and 2050. And at the same time, the Climate Justice Working Group has been preparing draft criteria. I understand that criteria is scheduled to be done and released at the end of this year. Is that right?
It'll be the draft. So what's
Right.
going to happen is that the Climate Justice Working Group will vote on the draft criteria indicators and this disadvantaged communities definition that will then generate sort of a list or a categorization of different communities. After that, that will be released to the public, and there'll be a 120-day comment period. Once we've generated and taken a look and assessed all of the comments, we will come back and look at the indicators, the criteria, and the list to see if there are any adjustments that need to be made. Once those adjustments are made, that final quote unquote list will be released to the public.
And that'll happen primarily in 2022. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And when it's initially, the initial draft is released for comment, essentially. And I think you have, what, 6 public hearings that have to be held?
Yes,
Across
there'll be
the
6
state?
public hearings across
Right.
well, since we can go back to the virtual format, we will try to have a good number of these will be virtual, but we will try to focus them so people, if they have comments about their specific area, especially with regards to the way the regions are, they'll be able to comment and not sort of feel drowned out by, larger areas.
I understand there was a bit of controversy or some debate, at least, over, whether, just from population, just from raw numbers, the populations in the disadvantaged communities that could be identified in New York City could be, the majority, more than the majority across statewide, and that some effort had to be made to examine disadvantaged communities that lie outside of the city of New York, outside of the 5 boroughs. And I take it that that is a subject that's been under discussion, and that when the draft criteria are agreed upon and voted on and approved, that a draft prospective list of the disadvantaged communities that meet that criteria would also be released.
Yes,
that
so
people
yeah,
know.
the communities that would be released, and New York City is extremely large. There are a lot of people. You have a lot of communities in that area, and so you're going to have the vast majority of those communities are going to come from New York City. But the criteria and the indicators should also capture disadvantaged communities that are located in suburban and rural communities as well.
Okay, and as this goes forward in 2022, do you expect that there'll be further development of the criteria for funding and the funds that'll be available to be directed to those communities, so that while we're considering what the criteria are, what the benefits or expenditures will be at the same time?
Yes, absolutely. I believe that, as we move forward with this, we will, like I said, it's going to be an ongoing process. But that should also develop alongside of the list. We'll have more opportunities to talk, more opportunities to actually look at different budgets to see exactly what these funding streams are and how they would apply.
Okay, and I guess I have a question from, which I think I've gotten some of it already, but a question from Laura McKellar about funding. If you could tell us, I guess, where the funding sources to implement the scoping plan that the CAC is going to come up with will be. Will there be, in the scoping plan that they develop, will there be a legislative agenda that they will prepare and submit to the legislature to either appropriate funds or create new programs, or regulatory changes that would go through the ordinary administrative process to be implemented? Or is how much of what the scoping plan proposes can be actually implemented by DEC regulation under the CLCPA?
I don't really do that aspect of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, but what I can say is what they are doing with the scoping plan is it's going to, the draft is going to be due in the beginning of 2022, and it's going to present scenarios that can be sort of adopted. And with regards to funding or how that's going to go, that really hasn't been determined yet.
But of the scenarios, will the CAC recommend the pursuit of one scenario over the others? I think there's 4 on the table at this point.
They actually have to work with the Climate Justice Working Group and consult with the Climate Justice Working Group and with the Permanent Environmental Justice Advisory Group. But as to how that's all going to work itself out, I honestly couldn't tell you. It's an ongoing process.
But there is a deadline. I think
the deadline it's at the end of 2022. So there is a deadline for how that's going to work. The goal is to present the draft to the Climate Justice Working Group has presented the different panels from the Climate Action Council presented the recommendations, and the Climate Justice Working Group presented feedback on those recommendations. So there is a bit of an ongoing dialogue between the Climate Justice Working Group and the Climate Action Council with regards to that feedback. And they will be reviewing that in the new year. So there should be some developments with that coming up down the pipeline. I would say probably about February, maybe March of 2022.
And after that, I guess as we go through 2022, at the end of that, we will have a final scoping plan that, everybody will have agreed upon. And at that point, the DEC is charged with writing new regulations that would affect the implementation of that scoping plan. I guess I'm concerned about whether it's just DEC regulations that could achieve it all, or whether there's going to have to be regulations from the PSC or Department of Transportation or other state agencies that would also have to be adopted in tandem with what the DEC is authorized to adopt. Can you
That
shed
process
any
is
light
kind of
about
being
that?
sure. That process is actually being discussed with our council's office and with the different council's offices from the involved agencies. So that's something that's going to be determined by them. And unfortunately, I'm not a part of that process.
Well, that's, somebody's got to do it, and it's unfortunate to me that the activity that's been underway there has not really been reported in the media at all. But as I say, those meetings are all there. But we can expect then that an initial draft scoping plan should be released, December of this year or January of 2022. And at that point, the public review process will begin. Is that right?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay. Let's see. Well, Eric is gone. Well, I guess, Alana, I really appreciate I don't know if anybody else has any questions. If you do, could you just get a quick something into the chat box? Our magician assistant and general factotum, Eric Swanson, could not stay. So that leaves incompetent me at the helm. And I don't think I see any further questions, but I guess we are just about out of time. So Alana, I would thank you very much. It's good to see, the director of this office, because not many of us, have had the opportunity to meet you, and we appreciate it. So
Oh, no, absolutely.
I hope we can stay in touch, and we may follow up with you towards the end of next year to see where we've come and how far we've gone between today and then.
Absolutely.
So,
And it's important to remember that a lot of this, especially dealing with the Climate Action Council, it's an ongoing process. And it's a lot of it, especially with regards to the funding and to how this will work out through the regulatory process, is all still being worked on. It's all very much ongoing. And once we do have updates and we do have a process, we absolutely will be, making sure that that is public.
all right. Well, again, thank you very much. And everyone, there'll be another, our next upcoming seminars will be on, I believe it's on glass next week, followed by what? I can't remember. Somebody tell, oh yes, e-waste on November 3rd, and hopefully storm debris on November 10th. And our breakfast on November 17th at the Irish Coffee Pub, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. And it'll be good to see everybody in person again. So we hope to see you there, and we wish you the best of the day. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Good afternoon.